Okay, with Mark Thompson, and we're going to be talking about Relatives for Justice, which is the organisation that he heads. What is Relatives for Justice, Mark?
I suppose it is what it says in the tin. It's relatives seeking justice. The organisation was founded in 91, Jude. I suppose the principal people that founded it would be Monsignor Raymond Murray and Clara Riley, who both spent the previous decades in the Association for Legal Justice, and of course the formidable lawyer Peter Madden, and a number of relatives, including myself. So in 1991, against the backdrop of collusion and state violence and huge questions to be asked and no justice given, the organisation was founded in Dungannon, St Patrick's Hall.
So are you representing people, or are you working for people from the nationalist/Republican side of things in terms of their relationship or the offences may be committed against them by the state?
Well, fundamentally today we're a human rights organisation, so our door's open to anyone to come to us, irrelevant of who caused them any harm. Initially, the organisation was led by people who had a particular experience of conflict, violence perpetrated by the state, or with the allegations of collusion, and predominantly, and for no fault of families, you get asked this question all the time, but the majority of victims come from one side of the community. But in more recent years, and because of our work and because of the integrity around our work, we've had a number of people from the unionist community come to us for support, and privately people that were in the security forces that had questions that needed answered and they weren't getting satisfaction. So a lot of that work goes on privately too. But we've an open door policy, and it's a human rights organisation.
But the great bulk of your work would be with nationalists and Republicans.
It would be.
So what do you actually do for them?
Well,
you're a lawyer, aren't you?
No. I don't. I don't have a legal background in terms, but I'm quite well versed, as most people around casework and human rights would be, in the law and what's required, and it's a skill that's built up. But that said, what we do for families is we analyse for them where the gaps are in cases. We help them to formulate and construct the questions, and we help them to build a picture, and then within that picture the pieces that are missing. And ultimately families are the experts. They know from their own experience what had happened to their loved ones and the questions that need to be answered and where the culpability needs to be established, I suppose. So in many respects families come to us and we help them navigate and look and build that picture, go to the Public Records Office, do some research, help them build the narrative of it, and the campaign around that are to seek legal advice and the challenge where and when appropriate the barriers and blocks to due process and justice.
So you're sort of helping them to make their argument and their complaint coherent, organised so that it could be presented in a court of law if necessary?
Well, yes, we would help families prepare that, and we form part of working groups with a number of the lawyers that practice in this particular field around human rights. So there's an element of strategic litigation as well. So we would look at cases that are quite strong, on the basis that in advancing those cases, by virtue of that, it opens up the way for many other families to follow, and they benefit from any of the judgments that would be forthcoming.
What would there be particular cases that would be well known among the public that you're involved with?
Well, this week I'm just out of the court with the Finucane family, who are appealing the decision by Justice Ben Stevens in terms of the judicial review taken by Geraldine, that there was a legitimate expectation that the family would have had an inquiry into Pat's murder. And of course that's just concluded now after a few days in that appeal. That's one case. Earlier this week we were involved with the case of Pierce Jordan. We've been at the police ombudsman this week, and it's today's news about the findings in the killing of John Hemsworth, died after being beaten. There's been some of the Glenanne families we were supporting this week, and we've been involved around.
Just give me an example, Mark. What would you have done with them this week? Say that John Hemsworth case you mentioned.
Well, that's a particularly important case, and it shows you the importance of our work in one phone call. John was assaulted in 1997, in July 97, as he made his way home, and he died 6 months later. And a few months after that, his family arrived to my door. At that stage, we didn't have an office, and they said they needed help, that they knew instinctively that something wasn't right. He was a US citizen. He pleaded with the police not to assault him. They beat him viciously. He had a broken jaw, neck injuries, and his body was badly bruised. And when his widow came to see me, she had photographs, and it was horrendous. And what we immediately done is we made an appeal locally. We helped to piece together. We got some eyewitnesses together. We tried to get the story together as accurately as possible. And John, fortunately, in one sense, had been the lawyer, Brendan Blaney of Flynn and McGittrick, and had began to get legal advice to initiate proceedings for assault on him against the RUC.
That was before he came to you?
Before John died.
Oh.
And then the family came to us after he died with the suspicion about it was all connected.
Well, you see, when he was beaten, did he not immediately lodge a complaint and
He did.
mount a court case against
He
the
did.
police?
Well, he did. He went to Brendan Blaney, as I said, and Brendan then began to initiate proceedings. But the RUC denied being in the area at the time. They denied a number of things, and they denied any involvement. And at the time, the ICPC also denied any wrongdoing and supported that view. But one phone call made the difference, you see, Jude. I phoned a colleague of mine in the United States on Amnesty International, Dr. Kathleen Kavanagh, and I said to her, Kathleen, listen, we have a situation. We have a man that has died in these circumstances. There's been a clot to the brain and a brain hemorrhage. He received a beating 6 months previously, and we think it's connected. If anybody could maybe give us a steer and look at the autopsy pathology report, and she did. She directed me to Professor Derek Pounder, who was then the president of Medical Advocates for Human Rights. And he immediately then got back in touch with us and with the lawyers and said, send me all the documentation. And after a while, he concluded in his medical opinion that the death was linked to the assault. And then through a series of processes going to the Attorney General in Britain, a new investigation was ordered under the RUC, supervised again by the ICPC. When that concluded, the Ombudsman's Office had only been established and they took carriage of it in its finality, if you will. But there was no real successful outcome. But then there was an inquest ordered, and then there was new evidence come forward. And so the inquest and the Ombudsman have concluded in their investigations that the John's death is directly attributable to the beating he received by the RUC. So it's important because that narrative would have never been told had we have not made that phone call. Had that family not have persisted and chased us and hounded us rightly so, they helped them and assist them. And that's one outcome today that you see over a period of 18 years. So it's long work.
Why? I mean, my simple way, I would think that if somebody's assaulted, they go to a lawyer, they take a case, or they don't take a case. Are you running alongside them and supporting them, or what? You know, do you feel you play a vital role there?
Well, we parallel that. Many of the lawyers that deal with this work in partnership with us and the family. So there's a number of roles and responsibilities. So what we would do initially is help a family to build their narrative, build their picture, build the questions, look at the evidence and assessment, and at some point in that process, we'll require legal advice and maybe the possibility, maybe DTC, how we can advance it in a court of law, or a Section 14 application to the Attorney General to reopen an inquest, a complaint to the Police Ombudsman. We have about between 40 and 50 complaints supporting families and made them to the Police Ombudsman. They're sitting there.
Do you think people find it easier to come to you than it is to go to a lawyer? Where?
Probably initially at first, but it's important that our organisation organically has developed. Jude, we've two halves to our organisation. What you see in the work that I would be traditionally involved in with our casework team is very well publicised. We have a second half of that, the partners, and it's a holistic approach at Relatives for Justice. We have a family support side and a counselling element to the organisation. We have Pauline Fitzpatrick runs our whole family support. Pauline is a qualified, accredited counsellor. Although she doesn't practice, she manages the entire mental health project. We have a dozen trauma-trained counsellors specialising in multiple traumas and violent bereavement through conflict. And then we have a clinical psychologist that does all of our assessments and then refers people on. It's a confidential process. Partnering in that, we have an intervention of alternative techniques around dealing with people's stress and anxiety. When people go to meet lawyers, have to go to courts, have to meet the HET, meet the police, meet the ombudsman, irritable bowel syndrome is a natural consequence of some of the trauma. How there's been unspeakable truths. How do they deal with all that? So those interventions, even in a softer way, about techniques of that and diet and managing that stress and anxiety and understanding it, is through our complementary clinic works as well. And then there's activities, classes, courses, and etc. So there's a huge package, and it's been developed through what we've learned as we've moved along. And interestingly enough, it's similar to what has happened in Latin America in terms of how the umbrella of support encompasses everybody through their entire journey.
Who pays for all this?
We get funding from the executive through the Victims and Survivors Service. That funds an element of our work. We get funding from the Irish government. We had funding from Europe. We're now applying again. And we get funding from the United States and a range of patchwork quilts of donations and funding from various people.
What led you into this work first, Mark?
I had a brother killed in 1990 by the British Army, and I'd been involved in community work in Twinburg. I'd been involved in community and political work in the area I grew up in. And then when that happened to my brother, I began to examine the nature of what had happened. I had a bit of an understanding living in this community, but not to the extent that when it came to my own door. And I quickly learned that the whole system was rigged, that there was no effective investigation, it was completely partial, there was no outcome, and there was a de facto form of impunity that operated, and it needed to be challenged, and that I wasn't on my own. And I suppose I gravitated then to people like Claire O'Reilly and Monsignor Raymond Murray, and unfortunately the Finucanes were in this similar position, and many other people like that. So I think it was just a convergence of people around key people that grabbed my interest, and my energy was then.
Who killed your brother?
The British Army killed my brother in 1990 along with two other men in an attempted robbery at Sean Graham's Bookmakers in the Falls Road.
Oh, yes.
It was a very
Remember that case, yeah. Would we now have the PSNI instead of the RUC? Has that made a big difference in terms of being able to have transparent accounts of things that happen?
Okay. I'm very clear about this issue, and it is something that is very vexed. In terms of the PSNI, should my mother, who lost her son, and my aunt, I had a cousin killed as well, who was a combatant in the conflict. If my mum and her sister went out this evening and their car was stolen or their bag was stolen, how they are dealt with in the context of dealing with the police in that incident is markedly different from the RUC. If my mum and her sister go out to find out what happened to their two sons, there is no difference whatsoever.
Are you saying there's obstruction?
Totally. There's complete obstruction. There's the 3 Ds: delay, deny, and death. The RUC and the PSNI are at the helm of withholding information in the courts. They are not disclosing information. And this resource argument is a nonsense around the issues of we're dealing with austerity being argued and we don't have the resources. The resources is there when you want to distribute £1.2 billion in payments to members of the security forces. The resources are there in the case of Sandy Lynch, when Danny Morrison, the overturn of the conviction, when you want to pay out millions of pounds, not to open up an envelope to see who the other agents are along with Scabatici. There is millions of pounds available readily. And just last week, one of the most senior officers of the British Army on the Andrew Marr show said that they are spending £176 billion on between missiles, armaments, planes and ships. So let's set this into context. The resource argument is a cul-de-sac argument and an excuse that is about prevaricating and delaying what is required. Simple as.
This will come as something of a shock to simple people like myself who thought that we had a fresh beginning with the PSNI in terms of their attitude to things generally, not just to having a car accident, but with regard to the past.
When it comes to the legacy of the past, because the RUC are so ingrained within elements of the PSNI in terms of its history, in terms of its corporate knowledge, and in terms of the vested interest that it holds.
Sorry, say that again. Whenever it comes to ingrained with what?
Who
is PSNI?
The DNA of the RUC is ingrained within the PSNI when it comes to legacy. How do you listen? In one of the inquests, the shoot to kill inquests, and when these inquests all began to open up, the PSNI, led by the then Deputy Chief Constable Judith Gillespie, along with Drew Harris, an Assistant Chief Constable who now holds the Deputy Chief Constable position, engaged in a number of seminars with former retired officers. And they were involved in schooling them and discussing with them how to give evidence if you're called to an inquest. And in the comments that were made, that were disclosed in documents to the court, was that we are all in this together. We need to paint as best a picture as we can. Now, that isn't a police force independently or impartially trying to robustly ensure witnesses attend court and provide accurate evidence. The destruction of evidence, and if you look at the killing of Roseanne Mallon alone in that inquest, we learned that there was a secretive unit connected to the special branch called WERC, the Weapons Explosives Research Centre, that produced false ballistic evidence in relation to the weapon used to kill Roseanne Mallon, when in fact it was used to kill 18 people and used in 2 attempted murders. They said it had not been used in any other crime.
But that was the RUC.
But the PSNI perpetrated and continued with the documents that they had. So the problem here is that there is a vested interest within the PSNI that seeks to protect the reputation of the RUC. And that's why they took the issue of removing this out of the PSNI and having an independent process is absolutely imperative and crucial to the success of moving forward. Currently, that isn't happening.
You're saying essentially that as far as these kind of cases are concerned, the present police force is not trustworthy.
It's not, and it's incapable of dealing with this in an independent way.
It is capable, surely.
It is
not choosing not to.
It's choosing not to, exactly. It's not, and it's not that it's not trusted. It has demonstrated that it cannot be trusted.
Would that attitude of the PSNI be the biggest obstacle that your organisation faces in its work?
It's one of them. The primary obstacle is the refusal of the UK government through the British Secretary of State to implement an agreement that they agreed in December 2014, and that were 4 mechanisms to address the past.
Which were?
Well, which was a historical investigations unit principally for lots of families, an independent commission for information recovery, oral history archive, and a thematic recovery process to look at themes and patterns.
So the British have agreed to that?
Well, they agreed to it in 2014, and then they introduced legislation that delivered to them a national security veto.
So are you saying that any time documents or evidence that is vital to these cases, are you saying that the British are deliberately using the notion of national security?
Well, they want, as what one person, the Irish Government Minister, Charlie Flanagan, said, to have a smothering blanket of national security to protect and prevent the disclosure of information that they would find embarrassing, that would show culpability, and would be other ways in their interest to cover up.
Are there any cases where they have produced evidence that has really helped you with cases that you're representing?
Within the courts, it's a snail's pace in terms of some of the information that is being disclosed. But you have to remember, Jude, information is disclosed on 2 systems: non-sensitive information and then sensitive information. And the argument around sensitive information predicates around Article 2. So let me give you an example. Article 2, the right to life of the European Convention on Human Rights, governs that states must protect life at all costs. When a life is taken, particularly by the state, there is a duty on that state and an emphasis to investigate promptly, impartially, effectively, and independently. That hasn't happened over the years, and the government has been found in violation of the convention. Now, in terms of moving forward around these issues of Article 2, what they have cleverly done, particularly around collusion cases, is they've turned it upside down on its head. And they've made an argument back in these inquests and in many other instances that we cannot provide you the information concerning the killing of your loved one because it could involve agents, the agents that actually were involved in the killing. And to provide that information would expose those agents, and we have an Article 2 duty to protect those agents. So really what they're doing is saying the people that went out to kill you, we probably know about it and you know about it, but we can't tell you about it because to expose that and to do that, we have to protect them people. That's our duty.
Are you not faced then with a wall that there's no scaling and no going through? I mean, in other words, if you have that degree of resistance, you're not going to get anywhere.
Well, our argument is you can't use that Article 2 in that way, and you can't use national security it can't be invoked when there's a crime committed, and these constitute crimes. Collusion and murder is a crime, and agents involved in that have committed criminal acts, and no legitimate government can say that the use of national security or the arguments around Article 2, and no matter how skewed they're used, are anyway legitimate in that context.
But that's what they're doing.
That's exactly what they're doing.
But can you change that?
Well, I think we can. We've used the international community. We've made submissions to the European Committee of Ministers, the execution of judgments. When judgments go to Europe, the supervision of those judgments are passed over to another body that scrutinises and monitors the UK's observance and adherence to and remedy of the problems. And so we've used the international community, we've used the UN. Pablo de Grief, a UN Special Rapporteur on Truth, Justice, Non-Recurrence and Reparations, has just delivered a report on Friday of last week that calls into question the overuse and reliance of agents and informers by the security services here and the police and army and so forth, and has said that cannot trump the rights of families to ascertain truth and justice for their loved ones. And that's where the argument sits.
And he may say that, but that doesn't mean that the British government's going to do it.
Well, it doesn't, but I think that there's a tide that is building up because there are so many families coming forward from right across the community that want issues dealt with. You know, who would ever have thought that the families for King's Mills would be making some sort of argument that there's collusion? You know, who would have thought
that's not well known, incidentally,
no.
Or at least you have heard of it, but
Yeah.
there isn't. It's not something that people springs to mind immediately when you mention King's Mill collusion.
And of course, this is shocking for families to hear, but it's something that other families have heard and come to terms with, in like Loughin Island or the Armour Road bookies or so forth. The allegations that persist now over the Shankill bomb. So in terms of, there were people deciding who lived and who died here in very high positions. There was a policy framework to how this all operated and was controlled. And that's not to say every soldier and policeman was involved in this. From their perspective and from where they seen things, they went out to do a service. Some of those people were sacrificed to protect informers too. So you have this nasty, deceitful web that needs to be untangled. And there's resistance from political unionism to untangle it, and from the UK government. But I think they're in a place where it's difficult, and they're continually having to justify why they're not doing the right thing, not only to the families here, and not only to the Irish government, but to the international community. And we need to sustain that pressure.
Okay, I don't want to keep you too long, Mark. If I was one of these people seeking the truth about what happened to my loved one, and seeking justice, how would you rate my chances on a scale of 0, no chance, and 10, very good chance?
Well, and each case stands on its own merits, Jude. And we don't hold up out of false hope to families. Families come here and we'll tell them this is a long, difficult and arduous journey. We don't make the decisions, you do, and we partner and support you throughout that, and we help you navigate that, and we are there for you. But if you want to tell the truth of what happened, you want to pose those questions, and you want to engage, for example, the police ombudsman's office can function quite effectively. And that's not to say you're going to get a form of punitive justice, but you might get the truth. Some of the courts in the inquest can, if they're allowed, if the inquest system is allowed to function correctly as it's now constructed in this kind of new era, it can deliver as well. And judges can recommend, as we are now with the Jordan inquest, whether or not soldiers or policemen in that case should be the file should be sent to the Director of Public Prosecutions to consider. Look at the family of Daniel Rooney this week across the way, and we've been over with them in the graveyard and with their lawyer Patrick Murray. They're having the body exhumed 41 years after. So, you know, there are developments that are happening. Doesn't mean you're going to get the person in the court and in the jail, or is that the objective? For many of the families, and I'll crystallise it and finish like this. If you had not have had the Bloody Sunday inquiry, and despite all the kind of stuff around it and all the costs with the MOD and the challenges and it going to London, the historical footnote of Bloody Sunday would have been Widgery. We need a truth process because the historical footnote in many of the instances that families come to us with has not been corrected. It's a skewed narrative, and it is a narrative of impunity and injustice. And it is equally important to validate and tell that and have it corrected. So punitive justice isn't always the outcome. Some families want it, some families want the truth and the acknowledgement and recognition. And it's different, you know, pieces for different people, and that's where we fit in and help people.
You don't ever feel outraged that, say, Bloody Sunday, you got an apology from the British government, and that was it. So they killed 14 people, and 25 years, whatever number of years later, they said sorry.
Yeah.
Does that sound absurd?
In some senses, if you put it like that, it does. But in another sense, of what I just said, the historical footnote now is corrected in that all those, the people that were killed, it was a huge injustice, and none of them were as claimed originally by the people that killed them. But importantly, Bloody Sunday isn't concluded. For some of the families, there's a continuing investigation going on, and a file will eventually go to the Public Prosecution Service. So for some of those families that want that, it's still ongoing.
Okay, last question. Should we not be looking at the future and not digging up the past and raking up old sores?
Well, if we want to build society, and we want it to be on the foundation of democracy, openness, transparency and all of its institutions to function in the interest of all of its citizens, well, then we're going to build it on sand if we don't address the past. And if the business community and everybody out there wants everything to move forward and be progressive, they've all an interest in dealing with this issue. It isn't going to go away. There's too much ill in this society, and there's too much unaddressed issues around the conflict. And in addressing them in a positive and constructive way moves us all forward. And I think that the phrase that we're using at the minute, because there's a lot of division, we need to heal together, find truth together, and move forward together in an inclusive way without leaving anyone behind.
Thanks, Mark.